New Zealand. So
wow,
NPI
you're spread everywhere.
Yeah, we're spread all over the world. Okay, I think we should begin because it's exactly 9:15 my time, which means it's 2 o'clock in Nepal. Good evening from New Zealand, where I'm based. Good day to everyone, wherever you may be joining us from. Welcome to the NPI hosted Policy Dialogue Series webinar on public-private partnerships on school education in Nepal. This webinar, for your information, is being done in partnership with the Asian Development Bank. And as you may have heard, my name is Gambhir Bhatta. I'm the Executive Director of the Nepal Policy Institute. The topic that we're covering today, very important. It's very important to have a webinar on both the education part as well as that on PPPs. Now, education as a social policy is on top of every country's agenda. Nepal, it's NPI itself, in the work that it did back in 2020 on the review of SDG goal number 4, as part of the voluntary review of SDG progress in Nepal, focused on the need for what we call quality education for all, not just education for all. And PPPs played a part in it. Just to sort of, I know this issue will be coming up during the various presentations, but in Nepal at the moment, it's estimated that roughly 1/3 of the population still cannot read and write. In the year 2022, 1/3 of the population cannot read and write. Now, the Constitution guarantees the education as a fundamental right, but if it's not accessible or affordable, that really doesn't mean anything much. So just 3 things for me to highlight from my side before we proceed with the speakers. Functional literacy in education should be the focus of education system in Nepal, NPI fields. There should be a focus on gender. That's predominantly the most important concept. There's no way a country can socially and economically advance if more than 50% of the population still don't receive the attention that they need in education planning. And look, there's a high rate of dropouts, which stymies any progress in this sector. So if we need to focus on any good education components of the SDGs, we should really focus on a leave no one behind approach, as the SDGs have talked about. And so to call for PPPs in the education sector, there is a need, we think, for a basic rethinking on what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it. And we feel extensive policy debates are needed in order to get a firm grip on how we can introduce and or strengthen PPPs in this sector, which is where this webinar comes in. We're very happy that Dr. Brajesh Pant and his team in the education sector group in ADB had asked to collaborate with us in bringing this webinar forward to you. Before I request our first speaker, Dr. Pant, to present, let me just go over some basic house rules for everybody to abide by. Please put your microphones on mute when you don't have the floor. That way, we reduce external noise. Please use the chat box for raising issues and questions. We'll be keeping tabs on it so that we can bring them to the attention of the relevant presenters when they finish. The session is being recorded, as you all know. That helps us in many ways, but particularly also to make sure that we're getting the essence of what it was that was discussed right. And finally, all the proceedings will be in English, as we've highlighted in the flyer. But feel free to ask questions in Nepali as well. If you're comfortable, we'll translate that when we pose them to the presenter. So now let me introduce the first speaker. What I'd like to do is introduce each speaker before he or she comes to make a presentation. The first speaker is Dr. Brajesh Pant, who is the chief of the education sector group at the Asian Development Bank. Part of his job is to provide technical leadership to the education sector work in ADB. He has over a quarter-century years of progressive experience in this sector, including in contributions in policy analysis, policy dialogue, and analytical work in different aspects of education reform. He holds master's and doctorate degrees in education administration, planning, and social policy from Harvard. Dr. Pant, let me pass it over to you. I hope you don't mind if I sort of limit you to about 10 minutes of speaking so that we can proceed with the context and then move on to the presenter. So
actually, thank you, Gambhir. I'll make it 5 minutes.
Less than that.
Because,
okay.
I think we want to hear more from
that's right.
experts. Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone, wherever you may be. And we'd like to thank NPI for hosting this and organizing this. Education is widely considered a public good appropriately financed by governments. Public investment in education aims to serve all, including the disadvantaged and marginalized, and meet minimum standards. However, private education can play an important role in filling funding shortfalls, expanding educational choice, improving quality, equity, and efficiency, and bringing innovations. Some of the successful countries like Japan and the Republic of Korea have involved the private sector precisely for these reasons, while not compromising in quality and equity as a cornerstone of education policies. We will hear more about the Korean experience from Professor Kim. The share of private education is particularly significant in South Asia region. For example, a report released by the Central Square Foundation in India in 2021 noted that the share of private education was almost 50%. In Pakistan, private sector has been encouraged by the government to expand access and quality of education through the involvement of education management organizations, or the EMOs, which Farooq might be also referring to. Similarly, in Nepal, the share of private education is quite significant, and the share increases at the secondary level compared to the primary level. One unique difference in Nepal is that government does not support private schools, unlike in other countries in the region. What is not captured in regular reporting is the share of private tutoring in overall household expenditures. For example, Singapore is the best performer in PISA, program on international student assessment, but they also spend the most in private tutoring. Private tutoring is quite widespread in Nepal and other countries in the region. It is important to note that private education exists in different forms and can be instrumental in expanding equity and quality while bringing efficiency and innovation. But this requires regular analysis and appropriate regulation and reporting to have the desired impact. Against this backdrop, I have three sets of questions to ascertain the value of private education, which I hope can be discussed a little bit. First, how does the quality of private education compare with public education? If private education is seen as providing better quality education or more relevant education, this may create a misperception about public education. Second, who is benefiting the most from private education? In other words, who is sending their children to private education? Again, if this is greatly in favor of private education, this could also create a major perception problem and weaken the voice and support for public education. Third, related to the second question is the public-private provision creating an equity gap? Meaning, is public education meant only for certain groups and private education for certain groups? Then it creates a problem. Global experience shows that it is critical to ensure that everyone is getting good quality education, at least up to secondary education, to provide the foundation for lifelong learning. As Gambhir mentioned earlier, this is so critical. Public policy needs to ensure that private education is complementing public education, and the quality of public education is also quite good. This allows the private sector to also bring innovative solutions, such as what we are seeing in the digital learning domain during the pandemic. Similarly, private sector is also critical in promoting STEAM education, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, and providing role models for non-traditional opportunities for girls and women. Finally, innovative financing may also attract the private sector to invest in education, since it is to their advantage to have educated labor force that contributes to productivity improvement, as well as entrepreneurial mindset that is critical to promote productivity and improvement in business environment. So with that, once again, I look forward to a good discourse today and also insights from the experts. So back to you, Gambhir.
Thank you very much, Bridges. That was good. I like the way you set the tone. You've highlighted the main issues, and hopefully with the speakers to come, we can sort of unbundle the range of things that you've talked about. Let me now request Mr. Farooq Moriani to make his presentation. Just by way of a brief introduction, Mr. Moriani is an international advisor with diverse cross-sector experience. He has worked in country in 16 countries and with 49 governments in all, and has served as an advisor to heads of governments, cabinets, and C-suite business executives. His work focuses on governance, economic policy, and political economy issues. And I might add, he's been a really good colleague of mine ever since long ago when I was in the South Asia Department of ADB. So Farooq, over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And I remember those days spent in the South Asia Department with great fondness. It was a great learning experience. Thank you to the Nepal Policy Institute for giving an opportunity to share with you some thinking on what public-private partnership in the school education sector in Nepal looks like and what it could look like. A number of questions that Brajesh Pant raised. These are fundamental questions which every policymaker, whether in Nepal or other countries, would like to be answered and would like to have movement forward on. If I may please share my screen.
Are you able to do that there, Farooq?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I hope the screen is visible.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. So what we'd like to begin our discussion on PPPs is to first of all define what PPPs are, because there are a lot of definitions and each of those definitions bring with them a different interpretation of what public-private partnership really means. So we are going to use the definition used by the ADB. And as you can see on the screen, it basically talks about a formal relationship between public and private entities through which the skills, the assets, or the financial resources are then allocated for a particular activity to complement each other and to share some risks and rewards. And just to highlight and break down this definition, just think of this, that there's a stress on a contractual arrangement. In other words, there's got to be a formal relationship defined between the two parties. And that arrangement has to be complementary. It is not in competition. It is a complementary process through which two parties agree to do A, B, or C, whatever that object might be. And the third important element is that there's risk sharing. In other words, if you have a PPP in schools, then the risk must not be lopsidedly divided. It must be shared equitably so that no one party benefits from that transaction than the other. And the last two elements of this definition relate to the fact that all PPPs in the social sectors look to optimize service delivery, and they look to provide good value to the citizens and to both parties. And that definition of that value is then defined in the contractual arrangements. And I just wanted to put it out there because a lot of people have different thinkings about what PPP really means. Now, the context overall in terms of the institutional and policy and legal context in Nepal is actually very interesting. So first of all, you have a new government structure in place after the new constitution was approved, which has devolved education services across the three tiers. There are certain overlaps, but mainly the local governments, they are responsible for school education. And there is input at different levels of engagement from the central government, the national government, and the provincial government also has a role because they have the Ministry of Social Development, which is supposed to be looking after and supervising the work of all activity under the social sectors. The constitutional provisions are again quite comprehensive. So there are 3 levels of provisions in the Constitution which are of interest to us from a public-private partnership perspective. The first is that the Constitution guarantees that education up to the basic level is free and compulsory, whereas education up to secondary is free. So it's not compulsory, but it is free. And there's a special provision for the minorities or the ethnic communities in Nepal, because Nepal is ethnically a very diverse nation. And to cater to the fact that those ethnic communities may or may not be in the mainstream, so to speak, education market, some protection in terms of a constitutional guarantee has been provided by saying that Dalits will get free education up till higher education, not just higher secondary, but higher education. And that there will be no discrimination in terms of disability or which ethnic group you belong to. And that puts Nepal actually in a very select group of countries in the world which have this provision in the Constitution itself. In fact, there are only 28% of the countries recognized by the UN which have this provision. And Nepal is the only Asian country which has ratified the International Convention on, I think it's called, let me just look through my notes. It's the only country which has ratified the International Convention on Indigenous People and Tribal People. And that kind of speaks to the kind of thinking that exists in Nepal on what should happen on equity issues in education. And then in terms of the policy and the strategic direction, there are a whole host of policies over the years which have over time emphasized the need for quality education, emphasized the need for equity in education, and also underscored the need for a joint effort from public and private sectors to promote and enable education services to be accessed by citizens. These policy and strategic directions have been in, one can call it in the same direction over the past 15 years. The different iterations of the strategies on education have all talked about pretty much the same thing. It's just a gradual move away and refinement of the processes and the kind of institutional arrangements that is the difference. Otherwise, in terms of policy objectives, there's not much of a difference over the past 15 years. Let's just look at and try to get a sense of what the marketplace of education looks like at the school level. So there are 3 kinds of schools in Nepal. The community schools, which are basically public schools. You have the institutional schools, which are the private schools. And then you have the religious schools, which are, in part religious education for all the 3, main, one would say, religious factions. When you look at the community schools or public schools, that is further divided into these 3 subcategories of community aided, who receive public funding. Then you have the community schools who receive funding, but there's they are managed by the communities, and there are also various kinds of restrictions in terms of who can set up these community schools, who can manage these schools, and what kind of funding or support that they can receive from the government. And then you have the community unaided. So these are schools which have very limited funding being provided from the public sector, from the government. When you come to the institutional or the private schools, you have 2 categories again. So there's the for-profit and the non-profit. And for-profit are company schools. So these are schools which have been established under the company's law, whereas the non-profit schools are schools which have been set up as trusts. And the for-profit schools do not receive any kind of funding. In fact, under the company law, you can also set up non-profit schools, but still register as a company. But even then, you're not eligible for any kind of funding from the government. As regards the non-profit schools, which are registered as trusts, again, there is no public funding, except in certain cases, government land may be provided on which the school building can be established. And the religious schools, they are eligible for receiving partial public funding, but for that they need to be registered, and otherwise they do not meet the eligibility criteria. So what happens in practice is that a lot of these religious schools simply don't register, and they operate on their own. So that's the overall picture in terms of what the school market looks like. And when we look at the characteristics of the school market, we find that, again, as it's not very unexpected to see that the community schools dominate, especially at the basic level and the early childhood or pre-primary education level. We also find that the number of institutional schools or private schools rises at the secondary level and above. And that's an interesting insight because in essence, the market for the schools at secondary and above levels is being catered by the institutional schools, and the government is lagging behind in this particular market segment. And the third characteristic that I'd like to share is that institutional schools are concentrated in only select number of provinces. And that's an important thing to remember when we look at other aspects of PPPs and of private provisioning. In these three provinces, province 1, 3, and 5, 70% of total schools are located. So there's a very strong concentration in urban areas. And if you look at the population migration trends over the past 3 years, from 2018 to 2020, there's an increase of 1.4, 1.5% from rural to urban populations, and that is creating the demand for more schools in urban areas. And the private sector or the institutional schools are catering to that increased demand because of the population growth and the population migration. If you look at the enrollment statistics, it's interesting that between this period of 2009 and 15, enrollments have increased across all levels, and this is true for all schools, whether they're public or private. The enrollment at the primary level has not increased, and that's probably because Nepal is a very interesting and very successful story of trying to achieve universal primary education. Keep this in mind, please, that until 1951, there was no schooling system as such at the public level. So for going from that situation in 1951 to 2015, where or today or 2022, where at the primary level the enrollment is very high, is a commendable success story. Most other countries, including my own country, Pakistan, struggle at this level. They are pressed for trying to achieve higher enrollments at the primary level. And what we also find is that yes, enrollments increase at every level in this period, but as you go up, as you go along the value chain of education services, when you move from primary to secondary, secondary to higher secondary, the enrollments are halving. So they're being reduced by 50% at every level. And there could be so many reasons, but a lot of literature points to the fact that the socio-economic conditions play an important role in the dropouts from schools, and this completion rate being negatively affected as you go up the chain. As far as institutional schools are concerned, enrollments have doubled between 2005 and 2010. And that's again true for all levels. At this point, institutional schools account for nearly 25% of all enrollments for all levels in Nepal. So that's not insignificant in any way. So 1/4 of your provisioning is coming through institutional schools. And 20% of all the schools and majority of the secondary schools, which we talked about earlier also, are in the private sector or are institutional schools. And more than 1/3 are at the higher secondary level are institutional schools again. So again, this is just to capture the footprint of private schooling in Nepal. And it's, as you can see, considerable. But when you try and look into the data a little bit more, you find that there is an urban bias. I mentioned earlier that institutional schools are concentrated in province 1, 3, and 5. And it's, the urban bias of private provisioning is evident at all levels. It's particularly high at the early childhood education level, but also highly significant for basic. It's more than 57% and half at the secondary level. So this is important to bear in mind in terms of, again, the equity issue, which Brajesh mentioned and referred to in his earlier introductory remarks, that is PPP serving to create a wider gulf in terms of equity, or is it reducing that? So the data shows that there is an urban bias, and it is, and we'll talk about whether it's actually causing inequity or not. On the teacher side, the total number of teachers in the institution schools at all level constitute a quarter of all teachers in Nepal. It's also interesting to note that female teachers as a proportion are higher at the primary level, particularly as compared to the public schools. So public schools would have more male teachers, and institutional schools would have more female teachers. Now, the issue of equity that we just referred to earlier. So if you look at this data, the enrollment, the trends are completely different. Well, not just the trends, but also the actual absolute numbers. So public schools are actually enrolling more girls, whereas the private schools are enrolling more boys. So there is a question mark over whether private schooling or institution schools are in a way driving inequity from a gender perspective. Are they impacting or reducing the opportunities for girls? Again, this is not an easy question to answer as to why this is so, but the literature available would suggest that socioeconomic conditions again play an important role. Parents are more willing to spend on their male child's education in private sector, because they think that the male child is going to be employed, and they will get a return on their investment. So they are willing to pay out of their own pocket, but send boys to school. So they're willing to invest in boys' education and not girls' education. And if you look at the percentage of enrollment by income quintiles, you will see that the richer you are, the more the likelihood that you'll be enrolled in a private school. And this is just data for the early childhood or pre-primary education level, but this is just to illustrate that enrollment in private schools has some link with the level of your socioeconomic conditions and status. And if you look at the marginalized groups, the Dalits and the Janajatis, you would find that the trend is downward. Between 2014 and 18, both enrollment for Dalits and Janajatis has declined, and at the higher secondary school level in the private sector. So this does point to these issues related to the equity, and raises questions about whether PPPs or whether private schooling in Nepal is benefiting only the poor or benefiting only the rich, or whether it's actually available and accessible for everyone. Learning outcomes, you will find that if you just take the NASA scores, in terms of equity, there's no difference. So there's no gender difference. Boys and girls score equally, equally well or equally badly, as whichever way you want to look at it. But there is no gender difference in terms of the assessment, test, at least, if you use that benchmark. But when you look at individual subjects and you look at whether the institution schools are performing better and delivering better results, then the answer is yes. So the graph on the left is showing the overall situation as regards student achievement, and this is for all schools. But when you break the data down and you see the difference between institutional and community schools, clearly the institution schools are doing better. So the quality of education one might deduct from this data is that the quality of education is improving, is better in the private sector. Very quickly, this is just to show you that majority of the expenditure in education in Nepal goes for basic education, as it does in a lot of countries. But when you look at the financing of education in the private sector, then you find that because of the fee structure, it is the parents or the households which are funding the private education. So there's no, the contribution from parents is what's driving the growth of institution schools in Nepal. So with this background of the education or the school education marketplace, what has been the response of the government from a policy perspective on PPPs? The first thing to note is that the government doesn't have complete information about the schooling marketplace in the private sector, simply because it is not able to capture the total number of schools at all levels that are operating. Those schools who obviously register themselves, that data is available, and that's the data that they are reporting that's the data that is reported by government. But there are a lot of schools which operate without registering, and that data is obviously not available. So it's to draw a parallel. If you look at the data on the labor force, there's a huge number of informal labor employment, and obviously the government doesn't capture that data, and thus the policies that you make are based on your guesswork, really, on what the total size of the marketplace is in terms of private provisioning. So that's the first thing that needs to be addressed, in the policy response, and the government is taking steps. I mean, you look at the different strategies, documents, and the policy documents that have been in place for several years. They have tried to improve the way in which they collect data and basically document the market. But there's still a lot of things to, a lot of aspects to look at in terms of how that data can be captured accurately. And the second, and perhaps even more important aspect, is that while the government recognizes the contribution made by the private sector, it sends out different signals which may reflect a certain low level of clarity. I wouldn't say lack of clarity, I would say a low level of clarity on what exactly does it want. Does it want private schools in Nepal, or does it not want private schools in Nepal? And I say this because as we will go forward and discuss, the next points, illustrate these mixed signals. So the first is, if the government wants to promote private education, then the mechanism through which they allow, the kind of models that they use to encourage and facilitate these private schools, those would depend, first of all, on whether the government understands how businesses operate. Once a company is registered, the company is there to make profit for the shareholders. And that kind of raises this whole issue of whether private education is actually a public good, and whether school education or education of any kind should be thought of as a private enterprise. And there are a lot of moral and there are a lot of theoretical arguments to that point. But at this point in Nepal, there seems to be slight, I would say, some level of misunderstanding on what exactly private schools are there for. So they are, of course, there to provide education, but they're also there to make money for their shareholders. And the regulatory approach that is used kind of complements that point about mixed signals, because first of all, you're saying that we want private schools. That's why you have the laws in place that allow for school education to be given through private provisioning. But the regulatory system that you have in place is very, very cumbersome. And you place demands on private schools, which seem very unreasonable and very unfair from a business perspective. So I'll just give a couple of examples. One is the government directs that 60% of the total revenues must go to teacher salaries. Now that's, you're preempting the decision by the board or by the company owners. And that's not how businesses operate. Secondly, the fee structure is very complicated. So you have 4 categories of private schools that can be registered. And there are numerous, eligibility criteria based on which you categorize schools from A being the highest to B, C, and D, going down the chain to the lowest level of schools. And the fee can only be structured around what the ceilings have been given by the education ministry. And it's kind of a constrictive regulatory environment, while at the same time saying, yes, we do need your support to reach and to improve access. So that's why I wanted to use the term mixed signals for that. And the measurement challenges arise from the fact that there's incomplete information, as we mentioned earlier. What you don't count, you can't measure. What you cannot measure, you cannot make a policy for. So it's a very simple chain of logic that follows that stresses the need for having a better way of documenting and accounting for all provisioning at the school level by the private providers. And of course, there are numerous governance challenges, and ranging from the fact that the newly devolved functions to the local governments and to provincial governments, they're still struggling with it. So, and that's understandable. Going from a unitary state to a federal state is not a small matter. And evidence from other countries shows that it takes, it could take 5, 6, 7 decades for these roles and for these structures to be fully functional and fully operational and performing well. But just to illustrate one aspect of the governance challenges, this graph basically shows how many of these provinces are actually working without an education officer, and by an officer, I mean not even one. And that's just an astonishing number, really. You look at province number 7 and province number 6. That's more than 2/3 of your education officers being basically non-functional, because there is no one who's been hired there and who's working there. So we still have a long way to go in terms of improving the governance for the private provisioning and allowing regulatory functions to be enforced at the local level. But the policy response that Nepal has, I think there are a lot of positives from it. And one that I'd just like to share with you is the Nepal Education Equity Index, which was established to look at whether there are substantial differences in terms of equity, and these equity criteria are access, it's about learning outcomes. So they're looking at different aspects of equity. They're grading and ranking each district, and those districts which are on the lower side, in other words, where inequity is higher, they receive additional funding. So the government has placed a mechanism for addressing the equity issue. The problem is that this equity index and the ranking and the subsequent funding arrangements, they are not applicable to the private schools, because remember that if private schools register as a company, they're not eligible for any funding at all. So if the government wants to encourage private provisioning in those areas where access or quality of education is a problem, and it wants private sector to contribute, it cannot, because then you have this whole issue of managing the registration process and making private schools eligible for receiving funding. And lastly, on the policy response, the opportunities for different kinds of innovation I have not really been fully realized. And I just mentioned education technology here, or EdTech. Yeah. During the COVID time, there has been an effort made by different stakeholders, including by government, to try and use education technology to innovate in the way learning is imparted or delivered. And during the COVID period, the Ministry of Education started a learning portal. A consortium of teachers, NGOs, and local governments in 5 districts started what was known as the radio schools. And there has been a lot of talk about on-demand learning modules being made available on mobile phones, because the penetration for mobile phones is much higher than the penetration for laptops and as you can imagine, in the rural areas, with all the socioeconomic conditions, people are more likely to have mobile phones. So there has been discussion amongst different players on what can be done to innovate in the way delivery can be made. But perhaps it's not enough, and the government needs to find a policy response to this, come up with mechanisms and incentives which allow for more and more innovations to be introduced at the school level. From all of this,
Farooq, I know this is your last slide, right, Farooq?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good.
So the key learnings from this whole process are that overall, Nepal. I know that when I talk to my Nepali friends, they complain about a lot of things about the school education system, and rightly so. I think the demand for better and more services should be there. But the fact is that in terms of access and narrowing of the gender gap, there has been quite a lot of improvement, and Nepal is a success story really on that front. It's the equity issues which continue to be, which continue to linger. We talked about this, that the orientation of the government is unclear and it is restrictive because of the regulatory systems that are in place at this point. So that begs the question, what should the next PPP policy look like, or the PPP framework look like for Nepal? So these are questions which the policymakers need to address. Is education a public good, and is a public good anymore? And that's not just for education. I suppose the same holds for health and other social sector delivery. So if you say that education is a public good, but we need to find ways in which it can be delivered through different means, that's a different story. But if you say no, education can also be a private good, and therefore let the market decide on what the principles and what the framework should look like, that's another story. So when you're drawing up a policy for PPP, you need to consider this aspect of how you want to approach education services, whether you want to categorize them as a public good or not. The second is, there seems to be a tendency to think of private providers as being, your profit hoarding organizations. That's not true. I mean, these education providers are providing quality education, and we saw in the one of the earlier slides that they do outperform on 4 subjects the students from the public school. So there is a difference, and they are making a contribution. So this conception of private sector being bad is something that we need to dispel. And the third is, there's got to be a school sector market segmentation strategy. If the government feels that the private sector should play a greater role in areas where there's an equity issue, or where access is a problem and the government can't handle that, then that's a segmentation strategy, and that has to be well thought out and discussed and agreed with the private sector. And incentives would need to be put in place along with a different kind of regulation or regulatory mechanism to allow for that market segmentation to find to become a reality. Also, for regulation, inspection and sanctions surely cannot be, in this day and age, the only approach used for regulatory purposes. And there are a lot of tools and a lot of approaches that they can use. And just to highlight what that could look like, in other countries in South Asia, including Pakistan, there's a lot of discussion and dialogue with the private sector on how regulation can be improved. Rajesh mentioned the education management organizations, which are a tool or a model used by the government in Pakistan. And that entails a great deal of policy dialogue. It's not just a top to down, bottom, it's like a client-patron or a relationship. It's a relationship built on trust and built on a shared understanding of what needs to happen and what kind of benchmarks that need to be set for those contractual relationships. And this goes without saying, unless until you have a well-functioning data system, and unless you push for disclosure. This is again very important, because one of the things that goes against private schools is that they don't disclose. There's no disclosure, so that's a corporate governance issue. But the education department at the local level and the Ministry of Education can surely put systems in place for improving disclosure and for investing in data systems. And the opportunity for cross-sector learning. Why can't there be collaboration between public and private schools, either in terms of training or in terms of curriculum development or in terms of any other aspect of school delivery, education delivery? It is happening, but it's happening on an individual level at this point, and it needs to find some institutional anchoring, and that can only be done by the government. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your patient listening.
Thank you so much, Farooq. That was it was a good treatment of what is it that the main issues are. I would have normally said you're going to get only 15-20 minutes, but I know you were the consultant for the particular project that ADB has been involved in, and it would not be fair for us to listen to the totality of whatever it is that you're saying. This is really good. Thank you very much. I picked up, among other things, this notion of risk sharing and the urban bias. But in the chat area, you can see a lot of discussion on a whole range of issues, which I hope to come to our panelists when with the presentations are done. Sorry about that. Let me move on now to Professor Young Kim for his presentation. By way of introduction, Professor Kim is currently a professor at Korea National University of Education. He has researched primary and secondary school education policies and school law. He has also served as a standing director of the Korean...
Stop screen sharing, please?
Farooq, can you... thank you very much. He has served as a standing director of the Korean Educational Association and a special member of the National Education Council, advising the president. He has published many papers and books, one of them being outsourcing educational services in South Korea, England, and Hong Kong, a discursive institutional analysis published in 2021 by Compare. So Professor Kim, I'll hand it over to you. I would imagine if I were to request you to keep it to 15, 20 minutes, that would not be out of the ordinary. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to make my presentation using my PPP slide. Yes. Yes, I'm happy to have the opportunity to make a brief presentation on my research. Yes, we believe that it's important to pursue the 5 important values in education policy: access, equity, and quality, accountability, and diversity. Our research focuses on how developing countries achieve these 5 values by using PPP. Korea and Japan are exemplary countries that have significantly developed education using private schools. An in-depth analysis of the case, 2 countries' case studies will help developing countries. In general, PPPs are expected to encourage innovation by providers, holding school accountability, empowering participation of parents, students, and communities, and promoting diversity of supply. Although the World Bank and other international organizations have defined PPP, in our study, PPP is defined as a cooperative relationship between the private sector and the public one to achieve common goals, tasks, and principles. We believe that each country's private school policies can be classified into 4 types based on government regulation on private schools and the financial support for private schools, laissez-faire and supervision, autonomy, and governance model. This table describes 4 types of private school policies. Each type is different in terms of school finance, government regulation on private schools, and financial support for private schools and accountability systems. Okay, let's go into the private school policies in Korea. This slide shows the changes in the numbers of students in middle schools, lower secondary education, percentage of middle schools and students. The percentage of private middle school students was around 50% in 1970, but has since declined and is now around 15%. The portion of this slide is about the high school, private high school students and schools. The portion of students in private high schools exceeds 60% in the 1990s, and although it has grown gradually decreased since then, it's still over 40%. Okay, this slide summarizes important Korean private school policies. In 1963, the Private School Act was enacted. This law contributes to secure the publicity of private schools. And in 1969 and 1974, secondary school entry opportunities were opened. In other words, middle school and high schools were allowed to enter without taking an examination. And since 1971, financial support has been provided for private schools. The government has been subsidizing an amount that cannot be covered by the school's own income, including teachers' labor costs. Yes, this slide summarizes the private school policies in Korea. Initially, the focus of the policy was on expanding admissions opportunities, and then moved to improving the quality of schooling. And in recent years, policies to expand diversity have been implemented. It can be seen that the policies that can be selected may differ depending on the degree of educational development or the financial situation of each country. Okay, let's move into the Japan's private school policy. This slide shows the changes of Japanese private secondary schools and the number of students and teachers. It can be seen the number of students fluctuates due to the effect of the baby boom. This slide is about the changes in private high schools. It can be seen that private high schools accept 40 to 50% of students. Japan's private school policies have also changed several times. In the 1960s, local governments began to provide subsidies to private schools. And in 1975, the central government has been providing subsidies. Japan's private school policy is characterized by an expanding subsidy, almost no control for what they teach, strict rules on granting and governance by private school law, and easy access to private schools. While reviewing the development process of private school policies in Korea and Japan, I would like to recommend the following 7 points to developing countries in Asia. The first one is about the direction of the development of education. In order to expand the enrollment rate, it's necessary to apply the principle of sequentially increasing the enrollment rate upward, starting with elementary education to lower secondary school education and to the higher secondary education. The second one is about the open policy of secondary education. In order to expand the enrollment rate, it's necessary to promote the open policy of secondary education. Quantitative expansions is achieved first at the beginning, and improvement of quality condition followed afterward. Third one is about the relationship between private schools and public schools. Private schools are important partners of public schools in the public education system. It's necessary to apply the principles of respect for the autonomy of private schools and the public interest, and to treat private and public schools equally. First one is about philo study. It's necessary to conduct a philo study project to review the relevance and suitability of the policy type for each country. Our team recommended to track the effectiveness and the suitability of private school policies in the context of policy goals. Fifth one is about check and balance systems, accountability. It's necessary to prepare for check and balance between external accountabilities by empowering parents and private schools. For the development of internal accountability, it's necessary to support the autonomy of private schools so that social and professional responsibilities can be exerted. 6.1 is about educational finances. It's necessary to registrate education finances in order to secure educational finance resources stably. In Korea, a certain percentage of the domestic tax, now around 20%, is legally provided as an educational resource. Final one is about the laws and acts about for private schools. It's necessary to review the laws and acts for the management and governance of private schools by considering the long-term development of private schools. In the private schools, the following are important: the balance between autonomy and public responsibility of private schools, the balance between support and control of private schools, and the possibility of cultivating the diversity of private schools. We believe that a public school law is very important to ensure the publicity of private schools. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. That was a really good tour de force of what's happening in Korea and Japan. There's several things there that I can see are very relevant for discussions with respect to what we could do in Nepal. I actually like the idea of and the point about legislating education finances. That's an area that I think we really do need to talk about, if at all possible. Today, if not at a different session. Let me now request Ms. Mi Kyung-shin to say a few words about the observations that she's had with respect to the presentations today. And by way of introductions, Ms. Mi Kyung-shin is an education specialist in the education sector group in ADB. Before she joined ADB, she worked for higher education divisions in the Ministry of Education of the Republic of Korea as either a director or deputy director, including University Students Affairs, employment and startup support, graduate program, university scholarship, and teaching and assessment in K-12. So over to you.
Thank you, Camille, for kind introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, my name is Mi Kyung-shin, education specialist in ADB, and I'm really honored to be invited as our kind of a discussion.
Can you do the full screen?
Oh, yes. Sorry. Thank you for reminding me. Yes.
Yeah,
can you see this?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And when I came to ADB, the PPP issue has been dealt with in many areas, but so I thought we need to think about more about PPP in education sector. And when I do some research, I found out that we have many research papers about the Netherlands case and the American case, and England case, European case. And actually, that was they started the PPP for quality of education. They have enough public school, but they want to increase the quality of education. Then they adopted the private sector to operate the institute. Then I came to think that in Asian background, our situation is government have less resource, and then difficult to find the finance to establish schools and then teacher salary issues kind of thing. So I thought that Korea and Japan case can be another good reference for our Asian country. So that's why we started this research. And then as Dr. Kim introduced, Korea has really used private sector very aggressively. Right now, 20% of low secondary and 50% of upper secondary. In higher education, 80% of higher education students are attending private school. But when you think of higher education enrollment is 70%, the world highest, then we can think about that the private university in Korea is not the same in America and America or UK. So we have a lot. In case of secondary and middle school, we supported a lot of a big amount of finance, but we regulate, we intervene a lot. So so with this proportion of private school, countries can manage the publicity. So that's why we can think about Korean and Japanese case. So and then in Korea, we provide the teacher salary and administration costs. And they have a lot of tax exemption for school foundation to establish and manage the school. But that kind of investment is to we required private university the same tuition with the public school. The private schools cannot receive higher tuition than private. That's why we provided a lot of finance to private school, and then we abolished the middle school and high school entrance exam to lose the competition, and then to give more equitable access for every student. And we call it as a equalization policy. So it is really a Korean background issues, but we allocate the we decided the high school with the rotary system, including the private school. But has been a big issue, has been a second important issue in private education, as you know, the autonomy and the excellency. So since 1990, we allowed the autonomous private high school. So their diversity and student choice is increasing, but our background, the basic principle is the equalization policy for high school and middle school. Support a lot, but we intervention a lot. So that reads the equalization of education, and we have Korea have low school discrepancy in PISA results. People think of when people think that why Korean students have a high PISA result, it is mainly because of that we are schools quality are equalized. The school discrepancy is the lowest, relatively lower in compared with another country. So Korea has still always experts, the opposite experts criticized this policy about autonomy and excellence, but still it is evaluated that contribute to the school social equity and education equality. So when I read about Paruk's paper, and Nepal and Korea choose the different way than that Nepal Korea choose that much investment, much intervention, but in case of Nepal, less support, less intervention. But we cannot say that which one is better. But we think in the terms of the value of equality and equality and quality, we can think about the other perspective, and then we can adopt some good examples. The policies we can develop each other. So that one is my point. And then the thing for private schools issue becomes more important because of pandemic. The pandemic issue is that because of the financial situation, parents want to send them to public school instead of a private school, because they don't their income is decreasing, and then sometimes school closed, so they don't have to send to private school. So their private schools management can be kind of they experience the difficulty to maintain and continue their institution. But actually, the opening the school is really difficult. So I think we have to think about how to support them, maintain the schooling and provide education as a stable way. So that is. And that should include the private teacher policy. So when we think about the education policy, we should think about the private sector issue. And then, like, even it is not like Korea's, district office have already, all of the district office has their separate private sector, private school division, but even though it cannot be done, it cannot be that way. So in our education policy, we have to think about how to support and how to make them accountable for in education. That's what I want to share. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mika. I like the point, the last one that you had about autonomy and accountability. And as the presentations have been going on, I've been keeping tabs on what's in the chat box, and this and the comments are wide ranging, but they're also, some of them are actually quite hard hitting and quite relevant. Now let me, in the little time that we have, there's a lot to chew over here, and we have very little time actually for Q&A. But I hope you don't mind if we go beyond the sort of stipulated 90 minutes that we talked about, because there are some issues in the that have been raised with respect to the presentations that have been made, and with particular reference to what does that really then mean for what's happening in Nepal. And it's not just a question of what's happening in Nepal, but the context in which things have been happening in Nepal in this sector need to be kept in mind. And if you follow the discussions in the chat area, you will see what I mean by that. But what actually got me really, striking thing was when Miking was talking about this, there was a point made by Manprasad Wargaji, who said, in Nepal, we've been advocating the same policy for private schools as Mikyung presented. This could be a good model of PPP in Nepal. So let me ask this question to Farooq, because I know you did the consulting work on this one. So Farooq, I'll let you answer this question first briefly, and then I will then approach. And what I was hoping, Miking and the others, was that I would ask Mr. Lee to come in after we've had some responses from the speakers, okay, so that he can actually have a bigger perspective of what you would like to say. So Farooq, first, go ahead.
I mean, my short answer would be that, there needs to be clarity, first of all, as I mentioned in my presentation, on what is it that the government of Nepal wants to do vis-a-vis public-private partnerships. If it wants to promote private provisioning on a greater scale than it is happening at this point, it needs to consider a whole range of models, and the one that Mikyung referred to is very much a possibility and something that can be examined. The only question is, there cannot be just one model under a PPP policy. A good PPP policy would create flexibility for entry points, and different kinds of models have to be provided. So that's what I would like to say, that, yes, it's a model that can and perhaps should be pursued, but it has to be viewed in the overall policy context and looked at other menu options. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Dr. Lee, you wanted to say something on this one. Go ahead.
I'd like to make a very brief comment on Dr. Farooq Moriani's presentation. I reviewed his interim report, and in his report, he mentioned that unpacking PPPs. And here in his presentation of Nepal education, he discussed the future PPP policies. And when we study,
Dr. Lee, can you turn on your video? Could you turn on your video?
it said that host stopped my video presentation.
Really? Okay. So I'm sorry for interrupting you. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I like to see the private school policy from the PPP concept. And I believe that PPP in general should be different from PPP in education. For example, the business like PPP is more oriented to short-term oriented and more complementarity principles, and it's a two-part negotiations. But in education PPP, I think we need more long-term engagement, and we have to share, and we have to follow some kind of same values and principles. And also we have to invite both parties to some kind of engagement, so they could develop the commitment and sense of responsibility and professional judgment. So I think the in your discussion of future PPP policy, I like to see that kind of a discussion if it is possible. But I really enjoyed your presentation, your interim report very much. Now, I have another one questions. In your interim report, you mentioned that in Pakistan education, the 18th Amendment to Constitution, it said that 5 to 60 years school age population should be given the compulsory and free of charge education. In the case of Korea, we have a similar constitutional statement on education. It said that the primary education should be compulsory and free of charges. Because of these constitutional statements, every Koreans, even after the Korean Wars, whenever they apply to schools, the school have to accept it. The government have a responsibility to accommodate every children who want to go to schools. And this becomes the basis to create the huge social demand for education. And with this energy, the Korean education be able to expand and universalize the elementary education, and we can easily expand the secondary educations. And many people call this is the effect of Koreans' desire for education. Now, I'd like to ask you, how the 18th Amendment to Constitution affect the demand for educations in Pakistan? Thank you.
Farooq, any thoughts?
Just a couple of responses. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Those are very important points that you raised. Let me take up your point about the constitutional amendment and also talk about the amendment in the constitution. In fact, the new constitution in Nepal. In both countries, in Pakistan and in Nepal, the constitution, as I mentioned, provides a guarantee for free and compulsory education up to the primary level. And in Nepal, it goes even beyond, as I mentioned, it gives the right to ethnic minorities for free education until higher education levels also. Now, the thing to remember here is that when these devolutions took place, in both countries, it is the local governments which were assigned the responsibility of providing school education. And so the immediate solution would have been, or the right solution would have been, that necessary financing should also have followed this devolution. In both countries, that is a debatable point, whether these levels of government actually have the resources to provide and meet their constitutional obligations. So that's one. The other is, you look at both countries. Pakistan, of course, is a much larger country than Nepal. But even Nepal, you're talking about a large number of children that would need to be catered for. And that's where this whole question about, and I'm trying to link with your first point about the difference in PPP structures. That's where the governments need to be careful. They need to be able to define what is it that they want from the private providers. If they say that you want the private providers to focus on areas where the government cannot provide schools, that's a different story. Comparing with Pakistan, all the PPP there is geared towards low cost or low fee or no fee schools. So the government says under the PPP policy, we are encouraging private providers to come in, and there are different modalities. One is that they just simply issue a license and encourage through fiscal incentives, tax breaks and all that. The other is that they say, we are going to use our government or public sector education budget, but we want to give this money to the private providers on a per student basis. That's another model. So I guess the answer to both of your questions would be, there needs to be far greater clarity within the government as to how it wants to use PPPs to improve access and quality and reduce the equity situation that exists in Nepal. If there's no clarity on that, I don't see how this is going to work for the benefit of children who are out of school right now or who can't access because they're from poor families. You know, it would be, I think, a misconception on our part to think that if the government doesn't have this clarity, doesn't matter because the private schools are already doing what they want, because that is going to likely lead to an exacerbation of the equity issue. If you don't have a policy in place and a regulatory mechanism in place which defines the role of PPP and private providers, you will find a mushrooming beyond what it is right now, and a completely unregulated market, which is not going to be in the benefit of the citizens of Nepal. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Farooq. There are several points in the chat box about gender issues, and I know, Farooq, you've talked about it, and I didn't see so much of that in the presentations from Professor Kim and Begin, but I'm sure there's an underlying discussion around that as well. But would any of the panelists there talk about the relevant issues of gender vis-a-vis public-private partnerships? I mean, I know we talk about the beneficial part of looking at it from a gender lens, but given the reality of what's happening in Nepal right now, and given the government's specific interest in or lack of interest in particular ways of proceeding with public-private partnerships in the education sector, how do you actually see this gender element playing out? And that's a question that has been coming in the chat room. I'd like to pass it on to Chandji first, just in case if this is related to the particular question that I've asked. Chandji, over to you. Are you there? No? Okay, while we wait, there we go. Chandji, over to you. Is the question related to something on gender in PPPs?
Hello?
Yes, hi, over to you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, like I would like to really show my face over there.
Right now we can't see it though.
Oh, I can't. Well, anyway.
No, we can't. Yeah, we can't. But anyway, please. I mean, as I said, the question was around gender and public-private partnerships. And we wanted to know, if you had a question around that area, what was about.
In Nepal's case, actually, I had very important community-related issues that I wanted to put. That's why I enrolled in this discussion forum. However, I would like to talk about this gender issue that, when it comes to the question of public-private, it is generally we find more girls in public schools than the boys, because, firstly, the public school is in terms of student fee and all that, it's, the parents don't have to pay much. And they want to send their girls to, public school. Like Mr. Farooq already made this kind of observation, and he presented this issue in his, findings and all that too. And the other thing is, like supposedly they say that the private, like in terms of the performance and so forth, Mr. Farooq already said that, the performance of the private school is much better than the public school. So that does, indicate that girls have access to less quality education via their, enrollment in public school. So that's how it is.
Okay.
And the other thing is also, there may be equality in enrollment, in the private school, the primary school and so forth. But as they, the classes go up, the dropout rates of girls more than the dropout rates of boys. That's another matter. Okay.
So can I then pass to?
But I have other issues which I would like to put afterwards. Sure.
Thank you very much. And you just leave them in the chat area as well. I'll be happy to pass them on to the panelists even after the webinar. So that's not a problem. But I like the way you've framed those questions. But so I know, Mikyung, you've raised your hand, but talk to me about the implications of gender the way Chandra has described it, and whether or not and what kind of a bearing that has in how governments can then go ahead and come up with a PPP policy. So first, let me pass it on to Mikyung and then to Farooq. Go ahead, Mikyung.
Thank you, Gamil. Yes, about the gender issue, in terms of World Bank data, the secondary enrollment rate in Nepal is 18.5. I'm not sure this including the yes, 85% is relatively high than other country in Asia country, but still, it's 15% of students are not at school. And then it can be generally the gender, the female student, and then the rural area. So if we are, if you are a government to have a policy to expand the secondary education generally, then the best beneficiary can be our girls. And then the second one is that in case of Bangladesh, they provided the subsidy for girls to attend the secondary school, and it received a very good result evaluation. So we can think about that. Who want to go to the more prestigious high school, then we provide some subsidy for a girl to give more chance to study.
All right.
Then
thank you.
If I add on the chat box, if I add there is some kind of proposal that Nepal also can adopt the supporting the private school. And then in case of that, we have a very different tradition. So, but we can try that on the voluntary basis. If some private school wants to follow the public schools direction and then want to receive the government funds, then under the the supervision of the office, then we can try that way. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mikyung. Now, very quickly, Farooq, response on your side with respect to Chandraji's question, and then I'd like to pass it on to Bishopji, who has a really good question of Farooq. So go ahead, Farooq.
Thank you very much. If you believe the government data, then we would have to say that in Nepal, until grade 9, there actually is gender parity. What you find, of course, is that out of school children, when you look at that number and that segment of the market which is not being catered for, there is a gender gap, and there are more girls who are out of school than there are boys. In terms of access, as we talked about this earlier, that the private schools are actually enrolling more boys, and a lot of research would suggest that that's because of the expected rate of return on the investments. If you classify fees that households pay or parents that the fee that parents pay, then the expected rate of return is higher for boys than it is for girls, and parents are more willing to actually pay out of their pocket for boys and not. So there is a gender issue, but I don't want to sound like a broken record, but really it depends on how the government wants to approach PPPs, because in other countries in South Asia, there has been a clear effort to target public-private partnerships towards certain aspects of the school education system. Now, if the government feels that the gender issue of out-of-school children or retention rates for girls, that needs to be addressed through public-private partnerships, it would have to have a policy framework for that. That doesn't exist at this point.
Okay, great. On this one, Biswaji has a really good question for you. It was in the chat area, but Biswaji, I'll leave it over to you to ask the question directly yourself and probably put it in context as well, if you don't mind. So go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you, Biswaji. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My question is to Mr. Moriani. Under PPP, can we set up public company with stock holding by multitude on the cost plus margin basis supported by the government? Because currently what's happening in Nepal is there is no public participation. So because of that, those who are in the government, in the policy formulation, in the implementation chairs are running education, running private education. So they are not serious or they are not honest for implementing the national policy set up in the Constitution. So that's why if under PPP, is there possible to set up a company like private company, like bank, like other schools, but the basis is just cost plus basis, because without margin, a private institution cannot run. So that portion, if the government subsidizes or supports, on that basis, there could be large number of people as will be affiliated with that institution. And on that basis, they can control. Now there is no control over any private institution. So they are charging fees, as a parent, I myself have suffered. I have myself suffered because there is no guarantee of fee. Anytime they raise the fee without any, pre-notice, I have suffered that. And there are so many people in Nepal, they have suffered. So is there possibility?
Thank you, Mrs. Yep, no, sorry, thank you. Sorry about that. I'm sorry to interrupt. The question is really good. It's very valid. And I think the way you phrase it is actually very relevant. Farooq, very quickly, because I see Dej's hand is up. We are really running over time right now, and I don't want to keep people waiting. So Farooq, please do respond to Biswaji's question about a public company in PPPs, and we'll pass it on to Dej for one last question before I close it up. So go ahead, Farooq.
Thank you very much, Biswaji. That's a great question. I think my short answer would be that under the PPP policy, when the Nepali government actually frames a policy for PPP, right now there is no policy for education sector. This could be one of the models and other countries have done it. So there's absolutely nothing stopping the government from identifying a menu of options or a menu of PPP models, one of which could be a public company that you referred to. And you also hinted to the conflict of interest. That is very much an issue. I know we have colleagues from private schools here, but there's been a lot of talk about the conflict of interest issue, about the role of PAPSON and the other association of private sector, as to whether their role has been constructive or whether that role has not been constructive. And I think, again, it points to our earlier discussion where we said there needs to be a mechanism through which policy dialogue is open and transparent, and not just limited to a few people. Thank you.
Thank you, Farooq. Deji, did you have the privilege of having the last question? There are other questions in the chat box, which what I will do is take them, pass them on to the panelists, and I hope they'll be able to respond and provide them, the responses separate from the webinar, if you don't mind. I'm really, because we are really running way over time. Deji, go ahead. You have the last question.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. My question is, as I heard the panelists talking about how private sectors contribute to the private sectors can contribute to education, but the question is like how this partnership can be developed. So in terms is one side is regulation of private schools in Nepal, which have been given the carte blanche to determine their fee structures, and there is no proper monitoring, and they have a lot of policy influences on the government. So the other point is that how this partnership can be generated in terms of shared responsibilities, shared benefits, because it has to be done with the investment education for, let's say, affordable education, number one, and creating proper learning environment. So these are the things. So how this partnership can really be conceived in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay. Either Farooq or Professor Kim, if you'd like to take that, please, really quickly, and then we'll wrap it up for today. So go ahead, Farooq first.
Thank you very much. So if you recall, the first slide that I presented was about the definition of PPPs, and I had broken that definition down into 3 or 4 key areas, one of which is risk sharing, the other is a contractual agreement. So the answer to your question, and it's a very good question, is that there has to be a formal contractual process which would define indicators on the basis of which the relationship would be measured, whether it is delivering results that had been agreed upon or not. And there has to be a built-in mechanism for improving the risks that are involved in implementing that partnership. And that's where those issues that you talked about, could be addressed. But there's got to be a formal mechanism which must be embedded within an overall policy framework. It cannot be done on a piece-by-piece basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Kim, any thoughts on that one from your side?
Gambir, he left a message. He has a class.
Oh, I see. Okay, no, thank you. That's okay then. All right, no, and this is something that I needed to talk about as well, because the person out, the chair of the NPI, who was supposed to give the vote of thanks, has had to leave as well, because he also has to go to for a class over in Thailand. So let me do this then, if you don't mind, because oh, you are there. I thought you had already left. Would you like to say any last minute words of vote of thanks and everything? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Yes, how private sector, when we used to use the PPP in education, we use that is a private funding for a private public funding for private sector. So important factor is the private funding goes to the public sector for the quality. So when we use that scheme, the private sectors should be the transparent for the public funding, using the public funding, and then increase the quality, and then they are supposed to desperately care about the equity, and then the giving the equal opportunity for less privileged students. Then especially the private schools, private sectors are in the quality issue. They are much efficient to operate the institutions, so they can achieve both of them, effectiveness, and then if they achieve transparency and then the accountability, then they can be more efficient organization in then sometimes in public.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you for that. Look, I really love to continue this for another hour, 2 hours if possible, but I know people have to leave. So including the chair of the Nepal Policy Institute, Mr. Khagendra Dhagal. Mr. Dhagal, sorry to keep you waiting. You do have the final word on this by way of summative thoughts and also a vote of thanks. So over to you, please.
Thank you, Gambhirji. First of all, let me thank Dr. Brajesh Pant, similarly, Mr. Farooq Moriani, Professor Young Kim, Ms. McKeown Sen, and Dr. Lee from Korean Institute of Policy for your valuable contribution to this conversation. Nepal Policy Institute is an international, non-profit, non-party political, independent international think tank, and it's really pleasure to have all of you here to discuss on public-private partnership in school education in Nepal. And I don't want to go in details because all the speakers made their points very clear to every one of us. And just, I mean, echoing what Dr. Brajesh said, that this is basically an equity issues, and then private sector can play a complementary role to what state is doing in public education. And Mr. Moriani actually gave a very comprehensive presentation. And yes, I mean, there's not much to add on that, but you know, in terms of the one thing he repeatedly said, that what Nepal government wants. I was speaking on that, and then actually that's the key thing. Yesterday only I was attending another meeting like this, and it was also about public-private partnership. And there the government representatives and also the representative from the major political parties from both sides, from the left and the liberal, were speaking on this issue. And what I learned from them is both sides agreed that there is a role private sector can play on this. So, but like rightly Moriani said, what types of modality that Nepal should go for? We need more debates on this. More public debates are needed. I think this is a wonderful beginning today, and we need series of debates on this because there are many things to look at. Even today, I can see the issues raised from gender perspective, from enrollment perspective, from dropping out issues. So these many things. And there are also issues that is really private sector doing anything good for public. So I was actually listening to private sector leaders as well yesterday, and what they said is, why we look at only the process? Why don't we look at the results? Who is delivering the results? See, state is in terms of Nepal. Nepal has adopted 3-pillar policy for prosperous Nepal. That is, one is like cooperative, private sector, and public sector. So 3-pillar economy. So for that, we cannot deny the role of private sector, obviously. But one thing that, when I listened to Professor Young Kim and Mik Kyung, they nicely shared the cases of South Korea and Japan. I was actually fascinated by what's going on in there. As a student of education, I really keep these things as my interest, and then so a lot of things to learn from Japan and Korea. And but one thing that has not happened, or that's not really happening like in Japan and Korea, is in Nepal there is an equity gap. Actually, private sector is putting billions of investment in education, and there is a result. If you look at them in teaching, there's more quality education they're delivering. Again, are they really doing good for public? Like Mr. Moriani rightly raised the question in the beginning, is this really public good? So these are the things we need to sit on a table, inviting different stakeholders and to talk more. We should have more debates. And in Nepal, if you just look at the data a decade back, government of Nepal was allocating about 16-point-something% to education. But if you look at this fiscal year's budget, only 10.6% is allocated to education. So that's the key thing. I think we should not forget that. So after a decade, our investment in education is going down significantly. So there are limitations of resources in the country. So this is the fact. We can't run away from this. Of course, there are many other issues to look at. So in that case, our resource limitation of the state or public sector can be supplemented or complemented by the private sectors. Yes, but there is a huge gap despite a huge investment from the private sector. And that is because we don't have the right model of PPP in Nepal at the moment. And for that, I think Moriani's presentation sheds a lot of light, and we have to discuss more on this, what type of model of PPP is suitable for Nepal. I think that's a way forward. And if you ask, what is NPI doing on that, or what is NPI thinking on this? NPI actually was involved in the review of SDG 4 in 2020, and we look at these things. So pretty much like what we shared today, that's what we also observe. And what we've been advocating is, I think the PPP should be a quality education for all. So that should be the end goal of PPP. And how would we operationalize that PPP is something we haven't really worked on. And I think this is the beginning today. And I really, really thank everyone making your time for this session from many parts of the world. And Gambhirji, you moderated so well. I see the flow of questions everywhere. And soon this proceedings will be out of this discussion, and the further series of debates will plan. And once again, I would like to thank ADV colleagues for joining NPI for this conversation, and hope we will advance this conversation in the days to come. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your time, contribution, and everything. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Khagrej. Yeah. Good night from New Zealand to everybody. Farooq, we'll be in touch. I look forward to getting the draft of the policy brief, if you don't mind, and let's have a conversation around that. Okay. Rajesh, thank you so much for all your support. Professor Kim, Professor Dr. Lee, Mik Kyung, this has been excellent, and all the other colleagues from Nepal and elsewhere that joined. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Stay safe.